Hi guys, my name is Beau Liddell of Images by Bolin. Post-processing is essential to make good Milky Way landscape photos. Although Adobe Lightroom isn't nearly as versatile as some apps for editing these kinds of photos, it's still possible to achieve very good results. So if you don't want to use a more powerful app such as Photoshop CC to edit your Milky Way photos, then this tutorial will help you use Lightroom to prepare a good baseline image destined for further creative edits, also within Lightroom. The steps I demonstrate in this video can be used on a single photo or on a composite photo that has been stacked to improve image quality. To get the most out of this video though, you should already have some familiarity with capturing the Milky Way. Make sure that you're capturing the images in your camera's raw image format, and then if you're stacking images to improve image quality, use a high quality image format such as a TIFF file, and know how to use the Develop module within Lightroom. I also can't emphasize enough that what I present in this video shouldn't be taken as strictly prescriptive, and that goes for any Milky Way photo editing tutorial, no matter the workflow and software used. There are many approaches to processing these types of photos, and even within Lightroom there may be different ways to achieve the same or nearly same end results, so you should only use what I present here as a potential starting point on your way to developing your own creative vision, style, and workflow. The editing approach that you settle on will depend entirely on your own imagery and what your end goals are. There really is no single right or wrong approach. So with that in mind, let's jump right in here with an example image that I'll also use in the follow-up creative editing tutorial. After I import a star photo into Lightroom, there are about 6 initial processing steps needed before I can begin my creative editing, and those are the steps I'll focus on in this video. I took this shot in summer along the North Shore of Lake Superior. Due to low light levels, Milky Way shots straight out of the camera, particularly those taken in a raw image format, will often look plain, lack contrast, and this certainly isn't what I want for a final result. Although the raw file looks dull, it nevertheless contains significantly more tonal detail than my eyes can see. As long as all the tones in the image aren't bunched up too much along the extreme far left edge of the histogram, which would otherwise indicate a severely underexposed photo, there's still considerable tonal information that I can recover, especially if I used a full-frame sensor. My first step to prepare this file for a baseline photo is to enter the Develop module and enable Profile Corrections in the Profile tab of the Lens Corrections panel, making sure that the Remove Chromatic Aberration box is checked. Then I'll inspect the image at 100% magnification to assess whether the default amount of chromatic aberration removal is appropriate. If I feel the removal wasn't enough, I'll go to the Manual tab and tweak the amount and hue sliders until I get an acceptable result. I'm usually conservative with this setting and remove only what's minimally needed, especially if I'm using a good lens. Otherwise, there's a risk it might remove too much natural color from the sky and stars. In most cases, including this example, the default hue settings are fine. But if the stars suffer from excessive color fringing using a particular lens, I might have to tweak the hue sliders some more. I usually use an amount of 0, but as in this case, I feel the fringing around some of the stars could be reduced further by increasing the amount to 1. For the second step, I'll go to the Basic panel and adjust the global exposure to an appropriate initial starting condition. In some cases, I'll have a good balanced exposure straight out of the camera, especially if I'm using exposed to the right or ETTR technique. But if using really short exposure times to keep the stars sharp, and or if I'm using a lens no faster than f/2.8, it's not uncommon for most star photos to be a little underexposed. This might necessitate up to a full stop increase in exposure, but this particular image was well exposed and needs only a small exposure adjustment. I generally want the midtones in the histogram to be centered or positioned just left of center, while also ensuring that the whites haven't been clipped. At this point, I'm not going to worry about how the overall image looks, since I'll be making many more adjustments later on that'll improve the look and feel of the shot. I'm just establishing a baseline exposure and ensuring that not too many whites or blacks have been clipped yet. If this image had been severely over or underexposed, then my options would be very limited, as clipped darks or lights cannot be recovered. Now, in the third step, I'll go to the Detail panel and apply capture sharpening and noise reduction as needed. When doing all my editing within Lightroom, I'll use a sharpening amount of between 25 and 45, and increase the detail slider up to 50, which restores all the original detail in the image. I'll also set a radius of between 1 and 1.4 depending on the photo, and usually set the masking amount to a level where the sharpening won't augment the digital noise in the image too much. Sometimes I'll set the masking as high as 80 or even 100 to focus the sharpening to just the brightest stars, again depending on the image. When applying capture sharpening, I'll zoom the larger image view to 100% to get a good idea how the sharpening and noise reduction is working, but I need to remind myself that how the image looks at pixel level on screen will not represent how it'll look online or in a print. How a photo reproduces entirely depends on the size and resolution it'll be reproduced at, as well as the viewing distance. For the most part, noise won't be visible when viewing a downsampled image online or in a small print. Under that scenario, I can often apply a fair amount of sharpening and noise reduction without negatively impacting the final view of my output. But if I'll be reproducing the image in a large format or significantly cropping it, then I might need to spend more time in this panel to get the settings just right. For my roughly 100 pixel per inch monitor, I can zoom into an image taken with my EOS 5D3 by about 33% to get a relatively good idea what the pixels, noise level, and detail will look like in a 13 by 19 inch print, reproduced at 300 pixels per inch and viewed at about 10 to 12 inches. In general, I'm pretty conservative with noise reduction settings and normally don't use a setting much higher than 8 to 10 for the luminance noise reduction, otherwise it might soften faint detail in the Milky Way too much. Many star photographers also tend to set a high amount of color noise reduction and may even max out the slider, but I approach color noise reduction much more conservatively, at least for the camera sensor and settings that I typically use. You might not be able to see it well on this video, but the stars actually have a fair amount of color in them, and as I boost the color noise reduction above 20, and especially if I max it out, the noise reduction removes far too much of the natural sky and star color that I'd much rather retain in my photo. As for all the other noise reduction sliders, I usually set them to their default values. Sometimes I'll implement this step later in my workflow after most of the creative adjustments have been completed, but regardless, at this stage of editing, I at least want to make sure the color noise reduction has been set to a level that doesn't remove too much star and sky color. So, for this image, I think the sharpening and noise reduction is looking pretty good for now. Next, in step 4, I'll revisit the basic panel and start working on the global white balance. This is a very important step, and probably the most creative part of preparing a baseline image for additional editing. Establishing white balance is also one reason why I only shoot RAW files, since attaining good white balance of the night sky can be challenging and is almost impossible to achieve on a JPEG file. What I'm really trying to do is find a relatively neutral starting point for the sky. White balance can vary tremendously throughout the night sky for a number of reasons, and the camera's auto white balance, or any fixed white balance setting I might use for that matter, will not be appropriate for different parts of the sky. True, the camera sees a lot of color in the sky that my eyes won't, but it doesn't get it all correct. In fact, it might well get most of it all wrong. What's more, I'm trying to balance true sky color with what my eyes perceived and also balance that with my creative vision for the shot. To obtain a good initial neutral white balance, I can use one of the following 3 methods. First, I can move the color temperature and tint sliders so that as many of the color peaks in the center or the left center of the histogram coincide or line up as close as possible. It can work quite well, and it's fairly a quick way to achieve a neutral color balance. Second, I can max out both the vibrance and saturation sliders to 100. The photo is going to look ugly and oversaturated at this point, but I'm just concentrating on the relative balance between oversaturated greens, magentas, blues, and yellows in the image. As with the first method, I can still refer to the color channel alignment in the histogram. I'll move both the temperature and tint sliders until I perceive a balance or midpoint between each color extreme. Then I'll reset the vibrance and saturation sliders to their default values. Now, instead of using these 2 methods to establish a neutral white balance, I can also go to the tone curve panel and implement a more sophisticated custom curve for each individual color channel while looking at the image or histogram as I adjust the curves. As I pull the curve of an individual channel up, it'll augment that color, and if I pull it down, it'll balance the primary color with cyan for the red channel, magenta for the green channel, and yellow for the blue channel. While it can take a little longer to adjust white balance with tone curves, if I use multiple control points for each channel, I can exercise much more control of the white balance for different tonal regions. Regardless of which adjustment approach I decide to use for white balance, I should now have achieved a relatively neutral color scheme. It may not be perfect, but it'll be a much better starting point than the white balance straight out of the camera, and now I can allow my perception to come into play. When I view the night sky, especially higher and away from any air glow or light pollution in the lower atmosphere, I perceive a white balance that is slightly cooler or bluer than neutral. Therefore, on most of my images, I'll often further adjust the color temperature by about 100 to 300 degrees below neutral, sometimes more, and might adjust the tint slider up or down just a few points to get the color of the sky as close as possible to how I remember it. But in this case, I'll increase white balance by 400 since I feel the manual white balance setting was just too cool for this particular night and location. The exact amount really isn't important. It'll almost always be different from one image, night, and location to the next, and it also depends on my mood and creative vision for a photo. In the fifth optional step, I'll revisit the Vibrance slider and increase it just a little bit. I like the additional saturation this setting can provide to boost some of the undersaturated colors in some photos, but I don't want to go too far with it. This setting can also help me determine if I still need to make some more white balance adjustments, so I consider the Vibrance adjustment at this point to be part of setting the color balance of the baseline image. Now I'm at step 6 and getting very close to a final baseline result, but depending on the shot, I might still not be quite done making initial white balance adjustments. I'm happy with the white balance throughout this photo, but I'll now show a 22 image 2-row stitched panorama at roughly the same stage of editing where I applied the adjustment brush to make additional local white balance adjustments. Similar adjustments can also be made using the gradient filter tool. Local adjustments might include fixing color casts within recovered dark tones in some of the corners, edges, and foreground of the frame caused by severe vignetting or underexposure as shown in this photo. It's also common for some of the sky and foreground to require further color correction due to light pollution and atmospheric effects as indicated here. If I select one of the adjustments, you can see the areas where a particular effect was applied. As I toggle all of the adjustments on and off, you can see the magenta color cast corrections that were made in the lower corners and along the bottom edge of the photo, as well as where I applied several adjustments on the right side of the photo to correct the yellow and green color casts caused by light pollution near the south horizon. Since Lightroom can't generate targeted luminosity masks, it's also possible some key stars might need color correcting in a particular photo due to color shifting produced by the initial global white balance adjustment made earlier in the workflow. In addition, sometimes many, if not all, these adjustments might need further tweaking or refinement after additional creative edits are made, but if I've done a good job with color corrections at this stage, I often won't have to revisit them. Some of the local adjustments that I apply might be obvious, and others subtler at this stage, but taking care of areas with color casts early in the workflow might prevent me from having to make more severe corrections later on during the editing process. So, back to the image I started with. Here's the original raw file without any edits. And here's the same file after applying corrections using my initial 6 preparation steps. It hasn't been a huge change, and at this point the photo is nowhere near where I want it. But I now have a good initial baseline image that's ready for the final creative edits in Lightroom that'll really bring some life to the photo later on. This initial preparation process often takes me only a few minutes to complete unless I have a lot of local adjustments to make. So that's it for the initial Milky Way landscape image preparation steps I apply within Lightroom. I hope you've learned something in this video that you can apply towards editing your own Milky Way photos. If so, please subscribe, like, or share as you see fit, and stay tuned for part 2 where I'll demonstrate how to make the final creative edits to this photo within Lightroom. If you have any questions about what I covered, feel free to send me an email at imagesbybolin@charter.net, add a polite comment below this video, or you can visit my website at imagesbybolin.com and click on the contacts link. Thanks for watching.